What if the person who saved Washington, D.C. from complete destruction was the same woman the Pentagon dismissed as just another paranoid analyst? What if the F-35 Lightning II that intercepted incoming missiles over the Capitol wasn't piloted by their elite squadron, but by someone they'd thrown out of their briefing room just hours earlier? This is the story of Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic, the intelligence officer whose warnings fell on deaf ears until her combat skills became America's last line of defense. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Pentagon's E-ring buzzed with its usual controlled chaos on that crisp October morning in 2024. Senior military officials strode through marble corridors with the confidence of men who commanded the world's most powerful military machine. Their polished brass gleamed under fluorescent lights, each medal and ribbon a testament to careers built on protocol, hierarchy, and the unshakable belief that rank always knew best. Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic didn't belong in their world, and they made sure she knew it. At 34, Daniella was an anomaly in the Pentagon's rigid ecosystem. While other intelligence analysts climbed the ladder through careful networking and strategic career moves, she had earned her position through pure analytical brilliance and an uncomfortable habit of being right when everyone else was wrong. Her cubicle in the Defense Intelligence Agency's J2 section was a fortress of monitors, classified reports, and satellite imagery that she studied with the intensity of a chess grandmaster reading the board. Daniella's appearance did nothing to help her cause. She preferred practical attire over the power suits favored by her ambitious colleagues. Simple blazers, sensible flats, and her grandmother's modest jewelry that had survived the Great Depression. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup, viewing it as time better spent analyzing threat patterns. In a building where image often mattered more than intelligence, Daniella's understated presence made her easy to overlook and easier to dismiss. But dismissing Daniella Dragic was a mistake the Pentagon had been making for 3 years running. Her journey to the E-ring had been unconventional from the start. Unlike her peers who graduated from prestigious military academies or Ivy League schools, Sarah had earned her commission through ROTC at a state university in Ohio. Her background was decidedly middle class. Her father had been a small-town mechanic, her mother a high school math teacher. The elites who populated Pentagon leadership viewed her working-class roots with barely concealed condescension, as if her lack of pedigree somehow diminished her analytical capabilities. What they failed to understand was that Daniella's humble background had given her something their privileged educations couldn't provide: the ability to see patterns others missed, to question assumptions others accepted without thought, and to remain grounded when others got lost in political calculations. Daniella's specialty was Eastern European threat assessment, specifically monitoring Russian military activities and emerging attack vectors. While her colleagues focused on traditional ground-based threats and conventional warfare scenarios, Daniella had been tracking something far more sinister: a sophisticated network of sleeper assets and advanced weaponry that suggested Russia was preparing for something unprecedented. For months, she had been compiling evidence of unusual military movements near the Arctic Circle, suspicious satellite communications patterns, and most troubling of all, intelligence suggesting that Russia had developed a new class of hypersonic missiles specifically designed to evade American early warning systems. The data painted a terrifying picture: an imminent attack on American soil using technology that could render traditional defensive measures useless. But every time Daniella attempted to brief senior leadership on her findings, she encountered the same wall of institutional arrogance and gender-based dismissal that had defined her Pentagon experience. The morning that would change everything began like countless others, with Daniella arriving at her cubicle before dawn to continue her analysis. The latest satellite intelligence had revealed something that made her blood run cold: thermal signatures indicating that the mysterious Russian installation she'd been monitoring had gone fully operational. The energy readings suggested they were powering up something massive, something that required the kind of electrical load typically associated with launching systems. Daniella's fingers flew across her keyboard as she cross-referenced the new data with her months of accumulated intelligence. The pattern was unmistakable. Russia was preparing to launch a coordinated attack using their new hypersonic missile technology, and the target signatures all pointed to one location, Washington, D.C. The attack was planned for that very afternoon. With her heart pounding, Daniella compiled her most critical evidence into an emergency briefing package. This wasn't her usual detailed analysis that took weeks to prepare. This was a red alert, a 5-alarm fire that demanded immediate action. She printed the most compelling satellite images, grabbed her security clearance badge, and headed straight for the office of General Robert Harrison, the Pentagon's Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence. General Harrison epitomized everything Sarah had learned to expect. A West Point graduate with 30 years of distinguished service, he commanded respect through a combination of genuine military expertise and carefully cultivated political connections. His office was a monument to his career, walls lined with commendations, photographs with presidents and foreign dignitaries, and a massive mahogany desk that served as both workspace and symbol of authority. But General Harrison also represented the institutional blindness that Daniella had been fighting against for years. Like many of his contemporaries, he viewed intelligence analysis through the lens of Cold War thinking, assuming that any real threat would follow predictable patterns and emerge through traditional channels. The idea that a mid-level analyst might detect something that his experienced staff had missed was not just unlikely, it was insulting to the natural order of military hierarchy. When Daniella knocked on his office door that morning, urgency radiating from every movement, General Harrison barely looked up from his daily briefing materials. His aide, Colonel Jeffrey Barnes, stood beside the desk with an expression of mild annoyance at the interruption. Barnes had made his opinion of Daniella clear through months of dismissive interactions. In his view, she was an overambitious analyst who confused dedication with competence. "Sir, I need to brief you on an imminent threat to the capital," Daniella began, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was about to reveal. "My analysis indicates that Russia is preparing to launch a hypersonic missile attack on Washington within the next 8 hours. The silence that followed was deafening. General Harrison slowly raised his eyes from his papers, his expression shifting from mild irritation to obvious skepticism. Colonel Barnes actually laughed, a short, dismissive sound that seemed to bounce off the office's wood-paneled walls. "Mitchell," General Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of barely controlled patience, "we've discussed this before. Your tendency to see major threats in routine intelligence patterns is becoming a problem. The Russians are always moving equipment around. It doesn't mean they're planning to attack the United States." Sarah felt the familiar frustration building in her chest, but she pressed forward. "Sir, this isn't routine movement. The thermal signatures, the communication patterns, the energy readings, everything points to an active launch preparation. They've been building toward this for months, and now they're in final countdown." Colonel Barnes stepped forward, his tone dripping with condescension. "Lieutenant Colonel Dragic, with all due respect, threat assessment is a complex discipline that requires years of experience to master. Your enthusiasm is commendable, but you can't jump from satellite imagery to predicting World War III." "I'm not predicting World War III," Daniella replied, her voice gaining strength. "I'm reporting an imminent, specific threat that requires immediate defensive action. Sir, if I'm right and we do nothing, American lives will be lost. If I'm wrong and we increase our alert status, the worst that happens is we waste some resources." General Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. The morning sunlight streaming through his office windows caught the silver stars on his uniform, emphasizing the vast gulf in rank between them. When he spoke, his voice carried the finality of a man accustomed to ending conversations rather than continuing them. "Dragic, you're dismissed, and I'm recommending that you be reassigned to a position more suited to your analytical style. Perhaps the Army's Historical Research Division would benefit from your attention to detail." The words hit Daniella like a physical blow. After 3 years of fighting for credibility, of proving her worth through case after case of accurate analysis, she was being exiled to a research position that would effectively end her career in active intelligence. But worse than the personal humiliation was the knowledge that her warnings would die in this office, that the threat she had identified would go unaddressed until it was too late. As Daniella gathered her briefing materials with shaking hands, Colonel Barnes added the final insult. "Dragic, in the future, try to remember that intelligence analysis requires more than just looking at pictures from space. It requires understanding the bigger picture, something that comes with experience and proper training." Daniella left General Harrison's office with her career in ruins and her warnings unheeded. But she also left with something else, an absolute certainty that she was right, and a growing determination to find another way to protect the city she loved. As she walked back toward her cubicle, her mind was already racing ahead to contingency plans that her superiors would never approve. What General Harrison and Colonel Barnes didn't know was that Daniella Dragic possessed more than just analytical skills. Hidden in her personnel file, buried beneath years of intelligence work, was a secret that would soon become America's salvation. Daniella was also a qualified F-35 Lightning II pilot, trained in a classified cross-training program that most Pentagon officials didn't even know existed. And in less than 6 hours, when Russian hypersonic missiles began their deadly arc toward the American capital, Daniella Dragic would prove that sometimes the most unlikely hero is exactly the one you need. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The walk back to her cubicle felt like a funeral march. Daniella's footsteps echoed through the Pentagon's polished corridors as fellow analysts pretending not to notice her red-rimmed eyes and clenched jaw. Word traveled fast in the intelligence community. By the time she reached her workstation, half the J2 section already knew that Lieutenant Colonel Dragic had been reassigned after what Barnes was calling another one of her paranoid episodes. But what none of them knew, what even General Harrison's comprehensive background checks had failed to uncover, was the classified chapter of Daniella's military career that had been buried so deep in black project files that it might as well have never existed. 5 years earlier, while still a captain fresh out of intelligence training, Daniella had been selected for something called the Cross-Domain Warrior Program, an experimental Pentagon initiative designed to create hybrid officer pilots capable of both analyzing threats and neutralizing them in real time. The program was so classified that even its existence was compartmentalized, known only to a handful of senior officials who had since retired or moved on to other assignments. The selection process had been brutal. Out of 200 intelligence officers initially screened, only 12 were chosen for Phase 1. They needed candidates who possessed not just analytical brilliance, but also the physical capabilities and mental fortitude required for advanced fighter pilot training. Daniella had been the only woman selected and one of only 3 officers to successfully complete the entire 18-month program. The training had taken place at a facility that didn't officially exist, a black site in the Nevada desert where the military tested its most advanced aircraft and trained its most elite personnel. For 18 months, Daniella had lived a double life. By day, she continued her regular intelligence duties, maintaining her cover as a conventional analyst, but 3 nights a week and every weekend, she disappeared into the classified world of experimental aviation. The program had pushed her beyond every limit she thought she possessed. While her Pentagon colleagues spent their evenings at Georgetown bars discussing office politics, Daniella was pulling 9G turns in experimental F-35 variants, learning to operate weapon systems that wouldn't be declassified for another decade. She had trained alongside test pilots with thousands of combat hours, many of whom initially resented her presence, but eventually came to respect her unique combination of analytical thinking and instinctive flying ability. The Cross-Domain Warrior program operated on a simple premise. Future warfare would require officers who could seamlessly transition between gathering intelligence and acting on it. In an era of hypersonic weapons and AI-assisted warfare, the traditional separation between analysts and pilots was becoming a dangerous liability. The military needed people who could detect a threat, assess its capabilities, and neutralize it without waiting for orders to filter through multiple layers of command. Daniella had excelled in ways that surprised even her instructors. Her analytical mind gave her an edge in understanding enemy tactics and predicting their next moves, while her working-class background had instilled the kind of practical problem-solving skills that proved invaluable in high-stress combat scenarios. She could read satellite imagery in the morning and use that intelligence to plan a precision strike mission in the afternoon. But the program had been terminated abruptly in its second year, a victim of Pentagon budget cuts and bureaucratic politics. The officials who had championed the initiative found themselves reassigned to other projects, and the 12 officers who had completed the training were scattered across various conventional assignments. Their specialized skills were filed away in classified databases, their dual qualifications relegated to footnotes in personnel files that most commanders never bothered to read. For Daniella, the end of the program had been devastating. She had found her calling in those Nevada skies, discovering abilities she never knew she possessed. But she was also pragmatic enough to understand the realities of military bureaucracy. She buried her pilot certification deep in her classified records and threw herself back into intelligence work, channeling her frustrated energy into becoming the best analyst she could be. Still, she had never stopped training. Using accumulated leave time and personal connections, Daniella had maintained her flight certification through quarterly sessions at military bases across the country. She told her Pentagon colleagues these were professional development trips, technical briefings on aircraft capabilities that would inform her intelligence assessments. In reality, she was keeping her pilot skills sharp, flying everything from basic trainers to advanced fighters, always prepared for an opportunity that she wasn't sure would ever come. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same Pentagon establishment that dismissed her analytical warnings had also forgotten about her combat capabilities. General Harrison saw her as an overeager analyst who needed to be contained. Colonel Barnes viewed her as a nuisance who didn't understand her place in the hierarchy. Neither of them had bothered to review the classified sections of her personnel file that detailed her qualifications as one of the most uniquely trained officers in the entire U.S. military. Now, sitting in her cubicle with her career in ruins and Russian missiles preparing to launch towards Washington, Daniella realized that her moment had finally arrived. The Cross-Domain Warrior program had been designed for exactly this scenario, a situation where conventional military responses would be too slow, where only someone with her unique combination of skills could bridge the gap between detecting a threat and stopping it. She opened her secure workstation and began accessing files that she hadn't touched in years. Her pilot certification was current, maintained through her quarterly training sessions. Her security clearance gave her access to real-time military communications networks, and most importantly, her analytical skills told her exactly where she needed to go and what she needed to do. Andrews Air Force Base was 20 minutes away by car. The base housed an active F-35 squadron, and Daniella's classified credentials would grant her access to both the facility and the aircraft. She had flown F-35s dozens of times during her training and quarterly maintenance sessions. She was arguably more familiar with the aircraft's capabilities than many of the pilots officially assigned to fly them. But first, she needed to confirm her worst fears. Daniella pulled up the latest satellite feeds from the Arctic installation, cross-referencing them with her accumulated months of intelligence. The thermal signatures were unmistakable. The Russians were in final launch preparations. The electromagnetic readings indicated they were charging their guidance systems. Most terrifying of all, the trajectory calculations confirmed that their target was the heart of Washington, D.C., specifically the area encompassing the Capitol building, the White House, and the Pentagon itself.
The attack was designed to decapitate American leadership in a single strike. Traditional air defense systems would be useless against the new generation of hypersonic missiles the Russians had developed. The projectiles would travel at over 15 times the speed of sound, following unpredictable flight paths that could evade conventional interceptor missiles. By the time existing early warning systems detected the launch, the missiles would be less than 3 minutes from impact. But Daniella had studied these weapons extensively during her intelligence work. She understood their capabilities and, more importantly, their limitations. The hypersonic missiles were incredibly fast and maneuverable, but they were also dependent on precise guidance systems that could be disrupted by a skilled pilot who knew what to look for. The Russians had sacrificed some defensive capabilities in favor of speed and stealth. The missiles were vulnerable during specific phases of their flight profile. More critically, Daniella's analysis had revealed something that even Russian commanders might not fully appreciate. Their new guidance systems were susceptible to a particular type of electronic warfare that could only be deployed from an F-35 Lightning II operating in a very specific attack profile. The disruption required precise timing, exact positioning, and a pilot capable of performing complex maneuvers while simultaneously operating advanced electronic warfare systems. In other words, it required exactly the kind of hybrid skills that the cross-domain warrior program had been designed to develop. As Daniella compiled her evidence and prepared to leave the Pentagon, she felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. For 3 years, she had been fighting for respect and recognition in a system that seemed determined to marginalize her. She had watched as her warnings were ignored and her expertise was dismissed by men who couldn't see past their own assumptions about rank, gender, and institutional authority. But now, in the most critical moment of her career, none of that mattered. The approaching crisis would strip away all the political posturing and bureaucratic games. In less than 6 hours, the only thing that would matter was results. Either she would stop the Russian attack, or American democracy would suffer a blow from which it might never recover. Daniella gathered her personal items, locked her workstation, and headed for the parking garage. She had spent years preparing for this moment without even realizing it. Every hour of flight training, every analytical report, every frustrating encounter with Pentagon politics had been leading to this singular opportunity to prove that sometimes the most unexpected person is exactly the hero you need. As she drove toward Andrews Air Force Base, Daniella allowed herself one moment of dark satisfaction. In a few hours, General Harrison and Colonel Barnes would learn what it really meant to underestimate Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic. But by then, their opinions would be irrelevant. The only audience that would matter would be the Russian missiles streaking toward the American capital and the F-35 Lightning II that would be waiting to meet them. The Maryland countryside blurred past Daniella's windshield as she pushed her Honda Civic well beyond the speed limit. Andrews Air Force Base loomed ahead, its imposing gates and razor-wire fence marking the boundary between the civilian world and one of America's most secure military installations. Home to Air Force One and the 89th Airlift Wing, Andrews was a fortress designed to keep unauthorized personnel out. But Daniella wasn't unauthorized. She was something far more dangerous, an authorized person acting outside the chain of command. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she rehearsed her approach. The cross-domain warrior credentials buried in her classified file would grant her access to the base and its aircraft. But using them would immediately trigger alerts throughout the Pentagon security apparatus. Within minutes of her accessing an F-35, General Harrison would know exactly what she was doing. The question was whether she could get airborne before they could stop her. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the base's perimeter as Daniella approached the main security checkpoint. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a sharp-eyed security specialist with 15 years of gate duty experience, emerged from the guard shack with the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of visitors. Santos prided herself on reading people, on spotting the subtle signs that indicate when someone didn't belong or had hidden agendas. But as Daniella rolled down her window and presented her military ID, nothing in her demeanor suggested deception. Her breathing was steady, her hands weren't trembling, and she maintained the kind of direct eye contact that Santos associated with legitimate military business. What the security specialist couldn't see was the adrenaline coursing through Daniella's system, carefully controlled through breathing techniques she had learned during her pilot training. "Purpose of visit, ma'am?" Santos asked, scanning Daniella's ID through her security reader. Aircraft familiarization flight, quarterly certification maintenance, Daniella replied, using the cover story she had perfected over years of training sessions. I'm with DIA Threat Assessment. We need to stay current on F-35 capabilities for our intelligence reports. Santos nodded, the explanation fitting perfectly with the routine training activities that occurred daily at Andrews. The security system confirmed Daniella's clearance level and cross-referenced her visit against the base's training schedule. Her classified pilot certification appeared on the screen, validating her authorization to access F-35 aircraft for familiarization purposes. You'll need to check in with the 113th Squadron Operations, Building 2847, Santos instructed, waving Daniella through the gate. Have a safe flight, ma'am. As Daniella drove onto the base, she felt a mixture of relief and mounting tension. The first hurdle was cleared, but the real challenges lay ahead. Andrews Air Force Base sprawled across thousands of acres, a complex maze of runways, hangars, and administrative buildings. The F-35 Lightning aircraft were housed in a restricted section of the base, protected by additional layers of security that reflect their status as America's most advanced fighter jets.
Building 2847 stood at the heart of the Fighter Wings Operations Center, a modernistic structure of glass and steel that hummed with constant activity. Inside, the 113th Squadron's duty officer, Captain Michael Rodriguez, presided over a command center filled with flight schedules, maintenance reports, and real-time aircraft status displays. Rodriguez was a by-the-book officer who had built his career on attention to detail and strict adherence to protocol. When Daniella entered his office, Rodriguez immediately pulled up her authorization on his computer system. Her credentials were impeccable: current pilot certification, appropriate security clearance, and a documented history of quarterly training flights. But something about her request triggered his professional instincts. "Lieutenant Colonel Dragic," Rodriguez said, studying his screen with a slight frown, "I'm not showing any scheduled familiarization flights for today. Usually, DIA coordinates these training sessions weeks in advance." Daniella had anticipated this obstacle. "Emergency authorization, Captain. We've got a developing situation that requires updated threat assessments on F-35 capabilities. My commanding officer sent me over with verbal authorization while the paperwork catches up." Rodriguez hesitated, caught between his desire to follow proper procedures and his respect for the chain of command. Daniella's rank gave her significant authority, and her explanations sounded plausible given the constant intelligence requirements surrounding advanced aircraft systems. "Which aircraft are you qualified on?" Rodriguez asked, pulling up the squadron's current status board. "Any Lightning II variant," Daniella replied confidently. "I've logged time on the A, B, and C models during previous training cycles." The captain's fingers flew across his keyboard, accessing Daniella's detailed flight records. What he found impressed him. Her pilot scores were exceptional, her safety record was spotless, and her quarterly check rides consistently rated as outstanding. Whatever else she might be, Lieutenant Colonel Dragic was clearly a skilled and experienced pilot. "Tail number 12-5052 is available," Rodriguez decided, printing out the aircraft assignment sheet. "She's fully fueled and passed her pre-flight inspection this morning. You'll need to coordinate with Sergeant Thompson in Hangar 7 for your pre-flight briefing." As Daniella signed the necessary forms, Rodriguez added a note to his duty log, documenting the unscheduled training flight. It was a routine entry that would later prove crucial in understanding how events had unfolded. But for now, it was simply another line in the endless paperwork that kept military aviation running smoothly. Hangar 7 rose before Daniella like a cathedral of modern warfare, its massive doors open to reveal the sleek, angular silhouette of the F-35 Lightning II. The aircraft sat like a predator at rest, its stealth coating absorbing the hangar's fluorescent lighting and giving it an almost otherworldly appearance. After years of flying simulators and older aircraft models, seeing the latest F-35 variant in person still took Daniella's breath away. Technical Sergeant Lisa Thompson emerged from beneath the aircraft's wing, her coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid and her hands blackened with the honest dirt of mechanical work.
Thompson was a master of her craft, a 20-year veteran who could diagnose aircraft problems by sound alone, and who took personal pride in the operational readiness of every jet under her care. "You must be the DIA officer," Thompson said, wiping her hands on a rag. "She's a beauty, isn't she? This particular bird just completed a major avionics upgrade. Her electronic warfare suite is the most advanced system we've ever fielded." Daniella's pulse quickened. The electronic warfare capabilities were exactly what she would need to counter the Russian hypersonic missiles. What kind of range and effectiveness are we looking at with the new systems? Thompson launched into a detailed technical briefing, covering everything from the aircraft's radar cross-section to its advanced jamming capabilities. As she spoke, Daniella mentally cataloged each system, cross-referencing the aircraft's capabilities with her intelligence analysis of Russian missile vulnerabilities. The match was even better than she had hoped. This particular F-35 variant had been designed specifically to counter the type of hypersonic threats that we're currently preparing to launch from the Arctic. "Pre-flight inspection is complete," Thompson concluded, handing Daniella a tablet with the aircraft status report. "All systems green, fuel load optimal, and she's carrying a full complement of defensive countermeasures. Whatever kind of threat assessment you're conducting, this bird is ready for anything." As Daniella began her external inspection of the aircraft, she felt the familiar ritual of pre-flight preparation calming her nerves. Every surface, every control, every system had to be verified before she could trust her life to this machine. But more than her own life was at stake. The survival of American democracy might depend on her ability to coax maximum performance from this technological marvel. The F-35's cockpit welcomed her like an old friend, its advanced displays and intuitive controls designed for pilots who needed to process massive amounts of information while performing complex maneuvers. Daniella strapped herself in, running through the startup checklist with the methodical precision that had been drilled into her during countless training hours. As the aircraft systems came online, she accessed the classified communication networks that would allow her to monitor the developing situation in real time. The latest intelligence confirmed her worst fears. Russian thermal signatures indicated that missile launch was imminent, possibly within the next 2 hours. American early warning systems had detected some unusual activity, but the threat had not yet been classified as an immediate danger. Daniella keyed her radio to Andrews Tower. "Tower, Lightning 5052 requesting immediate takeoff clearance for training flight." "Lightning 5052, you are cleared for takeoff on runway 19 left. Contact departure control on 124.85. Have a good flight." As Daniella taxied toward the runway, she caught sight of several security vehicles racing toward Hangar 7. Her unauthorized use of classified credentials had finally triggered Pentagon security protocols. General Harrison had discovered what she was doing, and base security was moving to intercept her.
But it was too late. The F-35's engines spooled up to full power, pressing Daniella back into her seat as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. In seconds, she was airborne, climbing rapidly into the Maryland sky with America's most advanced fighter jet and a desperate plan to save the nation's capital. Behind her, Andrews Air Force Base erupted into controlled chaos as security teams realized that Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic had just stolen 100 million aircraft and disappeared into the gathering dusk. Ahead of her, Russian hypersonic missiles were beginning their final countdown sequence, their targeting computers locked on to the heart of Washington, D.C. The race to save American democracy had begun, and Daniella Dragic was the only pilot in position to win it. 25,000 feet above the Chesapeake Bay, Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic pushed the F-35 Lightning II through a climbing turn that would have impressed even the most seasoned test pilots. The aircraft responded to her inputs with precision that bordered on telepathic, its fly-by-wire controls translating her intentions into graceful arcs through the darkening sky. But Daniella had no time to appreciate the technological marvel beneath her. Every second that passed brought Russian hypersonic missiles closer to their launch window.
Her helmet-mounted display showed a complex array of information streams: satellite feeds from the Arctic installation, encrypted communications intercepts, and most urgently, a growing constellation of American military aircraft being scrambled to intercept her. The Pentagon's response had been swift and overwhelming. Within minutes of her unauthorized takeoff, General Harrison had declared her a rogue asset and authorized the use of force to bring her down. Lightning 5052, this is Colonel James Mitchell, 113th Fighter Squadron Commander, crackled through her radio. You are ordered to return to base immediately. Failure to comply will result in defensive action. Daniella recognized Mitchell's voice from her previous training visits to Andrews. He was a competent pilot and a decent man, but he was also following orders from superiors who didn't understand the true nature of the threat bearing down on Washington. She keyed her radio, choosing her words carefully. Colonel Mitchell, this is Lieutenant Colonel Dragic. I'm responding to an imminent national security threat that requires immediate action. Check your intelligence feeds from Arctic Station Delta 7. Russian hypersonic missiles are in final launch preparation. Dragic, I don't care what you think you've discovered. You've stolen a military aircraft and violated about 15 different articles of military law. Return to base now, or we will shoot you down. The radio went silent, but Daniella's radar warning receivers immediately lit up with new contacts. 4 F-16 Fighting Falcons had launched from Andrews and were climbing rapidly to intercept her position. Behind them, 2 more F-35s from the 159th Fighter Wing were also airborne, their advanced sensors already locking onto her aircraft's electronic signature. But Daniella had advantages that her pursuers didn't realize. Her cross-domain warrior training had included extensive work in electronic warfare and stealth operations. More importantly, she understood the F-35's capabilities better than most pilots who flew them regularly. While they saw the Lightning II as a fighter aircraft, she understood it as an integrated intelligence gathering and electronic warfare platform. Her fingers flew across the cockpit's touchscreens, activating systems that most pilots never used. The F-35's distributed aperture system gave her 360-degree situational awareness, while its advanced electronic warfare suite began mapping the electromagnetic signatures of every aircraft and ground installation within a 100-mile radius. Most critically, she began monitoring the classified communication channels that connected American early warning systems with the Pentagon's command structure. What she heard confirmed her worst fears. The Department of Defense's Threat Assessment Center had detected unusual activity in the Arctic, but they were classifying it as routine Russian military exercises. The thermal signatures that clearly indicated missile launch preparation were being dismissed as equipment testing. Even now, with less than 90 minutes until the projected launch window, American leadership remained convinced that Daniella was suffering from paranoid delusions. Lightning 5052, this is General Harrison, came a new voice on the emergency frequency. Lieutenant Colonel Dragic, you are to cease this unauthorized action immediately. You are mentally unstable and pose a threat to national security. Land your aircraft now or face the consequences. The irony burned in Daniella's chest like acid. The man who had dismissed her warnings and destroyed her career was now calling her mentally unstable while Russian missiles prepared to incinerate the American capital. But she pushed aside her anger. Emotional control had been one of the first lessons of her pilot training, and she would need every ounce of mental clarity for what lay ahead. Instead of responding to Harrison, Daniella switched to a different frequency and accessed the Pentagon's classified satellite network. Using her intelligence credentials, she began uploading real-time data from the Arctic installation directly to key military commanders who weren't part of Harrison's inner circle. If she couldn't convince the Pentagon's leadership through official channels, she would go around them. Admiral Rebecca Torres, commander of NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain facility, was the first to receive Daniella's data packet. Torres had built her career on taking threats seriously, even when they seemed improbable. As she reviewed the satellite imagery and electromagnetic analysis that Daniella was transmitting, her expression grew increasingly grim. "Get me a direct line to the president," Torres ordered her communications officer. "We may have a problem." Meanwhile, above the Chesapeake, the aerial chase was intensifying. The pursuing F-16s had closed to within 20 miles and were preparing to engage. Their pilots had been given clear orders: disable or destroy the rogue F-35 before it could reach its unknown destination. But Daniella had no intention of making their job easy.
She pushed the Lightning II into a steep dive, using the aircraft's superior acceleration to build speed while simultaneously dropping below the F-16's optimal engagement envelope. The F-35's stealth characteristics made it difficult to track on radar, and her sudden altitude change forced the pursuing pilots to adjust their intercept calculations. Fox 3 called Captain Sarah Williams, the lead F-16 pilot, as she launched an AIM-120 AMRAAM missile at Daniella's aircraft. The advanced radar-guided missile streaked through the sky at over 3 times the speed of sound, its sophisticated guidance system locked onto the F-35's electronic signature. But Daniella had been expecting this moment. Her electronic warfare training kicked in as she activated the Lightning II's advanced countermeasure suite. Chaff and flares erupted from the F-35's dispensers, while its electronic warfare systems bombarded the incoming missile with false radar returns and jamming signals. The AMRAAM, confused by the electronic noise and thermal decoys, lost its lock and detonated harmlessly several hundred yards away. "Negative impact," Williams reported, frustration evident in her voice. "Target is employing advanced countermeasures." But Daniella's evasive maneuvers had cost her precious time and fuel. She checked her navigation display. She was still over an hour away from the optimal intercept position where she could engage the Russian missiles. Meanwhile, her pursuers were calling in reinforcements, and the Pentagon was coordinating with civilian air traffic control to clear the skies of commercial aircraft. The stakes became even higher when Daniella's encrypted intelligence feeds showed new activity at the Arctic installation. The thermal signatures indicated that the Russian missiles had entered their final launch sequence. Massive power draws suggested that guidance systems were being activated and targeting coordinates were being uploaded. Most terrifying of all, her analysis of the electromagnetic patterns indicated that the Russians were preparing to launch not 1 or 2 missiles, but an entire salvo. At least 6 hypersonic projectiles designed to overwhelm American missile defense systems through sheer numbers and coordinated timing. Daniella keyed her radio to the emergency frequency used by the Secret Service and other protective agencies. "White House Security, this is Lieutenant Colonel Dragic with urgent threat information. Russian hypersonic missiles will impact Washington, D.C. in approximately 73 minutes. Recommend immediate evacuation of all government facilities." The response was immediate and skeptical. "Unknown aircraft, you are broadcasting on a classified frequency. Identify yourself and state your authorization for this transmission." "My authorization is 6 incoming missiles that will level the Capitol building," Daniella replied tersely. "Check your satellite feeds. Check Arctic Station Delta 7. Check the electromagnetic signatures. The attack is real and it's happening now." Her warning triggered a flurry of activity in secure facilities across the Washington area. While some officials dismissed her transmission as the ravings of a mentally unstable pilot, others began quietly implementing contingency protocols. The vice president's security detail received orders to prepare for possible evacuation. Key congressional leaders were discreetly advised of a potential security situation. But even as some elements of the government began to take her warning seriously, the military pursuit continued to intensify. 2 more F-35s had joined the chase, and an E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft was coordinating the intercept from 30,000 feet. The electronic warfare battle between Daniella and her pursuers was creating a constellation of radar jamming and countermeasures that lit up every military sensor on the East Coast. "Lightning 505, came Mitchell's voice again. "You have 30 seconds to surrender before we use lethal force. This is your final warning." Daniella looked at her fuel gauge, calculated the distance to her intercept point, and made a decision that would either save American democracy or end her life in a ball of flame.
Instead of surrendering, she pushed the F-35's throttles to full afterburner and pointed the aircraft's nose toward the Arctic Circle. The race to save Washington, D.C. had entered its final phase, and Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic was running out of time, fuel, and options. Behind her, the most advanced military aircraft in the world were closing in for the kill. Ahead of her, Russian hypersonic missiles were preparing to launch the most devastating attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. The fate of the nation now rested in the hands of the woman the Pentagon had dismissed as paranoid and unstable. In less than an hour, either Daniella would prove her intelligence analysis correct by intercepting the incoming missiles, or her warnings would be validated by the destruction of the American capital. 400 miles north of the Arctic Circle, Colonel Viktor Petrov stood in the command center of Installation Severny Vetter, watching as his technicians completed the final preparations for Operation Thunderbolt. The facility, buried beneath 50 feet of permafrost and disguised as a weather research station, housed Russia's most advanced hypersonic weapon system. 6 Zircon-M missiles capable of reaching any target in North America within 12 minutes of launch. Petrov was a career military officer who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of strategic warfare. Unlike the politicians in Moscow who dreamed of global dominance, he understood that modern conflict was won through precision rather than brutality. Operation Thunderbolt wasn't designed to destroy America. It was designed to paralyze American leadership at exactly the moment when Russia needed them incapacitated. "Final systems check, sir," reported Major Anya Volkov. "All 6 missiles show green across the board. Guidance systems are locked on target coordinates. We are ready for launch on your command." The target package was elegant in its simplicity. 3 missiles would strike the Capitol building during an emergency joint session of Congress. 2 more would eliminate the Pentagon's command structure. The final missile would crater the White House, removing the American president and his senior staff from the equation. Within minutes of impact, the United States would find itself leaderless, its command structure decapitated, its ability to respond to international crises effectively neutralized. Meanwhile, Russian forces positioned in Eastern Europe would begin their own operations, secure in the knowledge that American retaliation would be delayed by days or weeks while the surviving government struggled to establish new leadership. By the time Washington recovered from the attack, the global balance of power would have shifted irreversibly. Petrov checked his watch. Moscow had given him a precise launch window. The missiles needed to impact during the evening hours when Congress would be in session and the president would be in residence. American early warning systems would detect the launch, but hypersonic weapons traveled too fast for conventional interception. The American military would have perhaps 3 minutes between detection and impact, enough time to sound alarms, but not enough time to evacuate their leadership. "Sir," Volkov continued, "American satellite activity has increased over the past 6 hours. They may be monitoring our facility." "Let them monitor," Petrov replied with cold confidence. "By the time they understand what they're seeing, it will be too late to matter." What Petrov didn't know was that at that very moment, Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic was screaming across the Canadian wilderness in a stolen F-35, her aircraft's advanced sensors already detecting the electromagnetic signature of the Russian installation. Her intelligence analysis had been accurate down to the minute. The thermal patterns she observed through her satellite feeds matched exactly with the final preparation phases she had predicted. 35,000 feet above Hudson Bay, Daniella checked her fuel status and calculated intercept vectors. She had perhaps 20 minutes of flight time remaining before her tanks ran dry. The Russian installation was still over 200 miles away, and her pursuing American fighters were closing the gap with every passing second. Worst of all, her radar warning receivers were screaming alerts as multiple surface-to-air missile batteries across northern Canada began tracking her unauthorized flight. The diplomatic implications were staggering. An American military aircraft flying deep into Canadian airspace without authorization was a violation of international law that could trigger a serious diplomatic crisis. But Daniella had moved far beyond concerns about protocol or international relations. The survival of American democracy now depended on her ability to reach the Russian installation before Petrov gave the launch order. Her encrypted communication systems crackled with increasingly urgent transmissions from American command centers. Admiral Torres at NORAD had confirmed the threat through independent satellite analysis and was desperately trying to coordinate a response. But American hypersonic interceptor systems were still experimental, and the few operational units were positioned to defend against missiles approaching from different vectors. Colonel Dragic, came Torres's voice over the emergency frequency. We've confirmed your threat assessment. Russian installation shows all indicators of imminent launch. Can you provide specific target information? 6 Zircon-M hypersonic missiles, Daniella replied, her voice steady despite the G-forces pressing against her chest as she maneuvered through Canadian air defenses. Target package appears to be Capitol Building, Pentagon, and White House. Launch window opens in approximately 14 minutes. The confirmation sent shockwaves through American command centers. President Elizabeth Carter was immediately moved to a secure bunker beneath the White House, while her Secret Service detail implemented emergency protocols. Congressional leadership received evacuation orders, though many representatives refused to abandon their posts without understanding the nature of the threat. At the Pentagon, General Harrison found himself in the impossible position of coordinating a response to a threat he had dismissed just hours earlier. The woman he had branded as mentally unstable was now providing the most accurate intelligence the American military possessed about an imminent attack on the homeland. Sir, Colonel Barnes approached Harrison's desk with obvious reluctance. Admiral Torres is requesting permission to communicate directly with Colonel Dragic. She may be our only asset in position to provide real-time intelligence on the Russian launch. Harrison's face was granite. His career, his reputation, and his understanding of military hierarchy had been built on the assumption that expertise flowed downward through the chain of command. The idea that a mid-level analyst could detect threats that his entire intelligence apparatus had missed was more than embarrassing. It was a fundamental challenge to everything he believed about leadership and authority. Absolutely not, Harrison replied tersely. Dragic is a rogue agent who has stolen military property and violated multiple federal laws. We will not negotiate with her or legitimize her actions. But even as Harrison maintained his official position, other elements of the American government were taking decisive action. The Secret Service had initiated White House down protocols, moving the president to secure facilities while simultaneously coordinating with state and local authorities to begin emergency evacuations of government buildings. At Installation Severny Vetter, Colonel Petrov received the final authorization from Moscow. Operation Thunderbolt is approved for immediate execution, came the encrypted transmission. Petrov turned to Major Volkov. Begin launch sequence. Target package Alpha through Foxtrot. Execute on my mark. The installation's massive launch tubes began cycling through their pre-ignition protocols. Thousands of gallons of liquid propellant flooded into combustion chambers, while guidance computers made final calculations based on real-time satellite data. The Zircon-M missiles, each weighing 12 tons and carrying conventional warheads equivalent to a small nuclear weapon, prepared for their journey across the Arctic Ocean. Missile 1 through 6, all systems nominal, ready for launch in 30 seconds. High above the Canadian wilderness, Daniella's threat warning systems suddenly exploded with new contacts. Her F-35's advanced sensors had detected the massive electromagnetic pulse that preceded hypersonic missile launches. The distinctive signature was unmistakable. 6 separate launch tubes were energizing simultaneously, exactly as her intelligence analysis had predicted. NORAD, this is Lightning 5052, Daniella transmitted on the emergency frequency. Missile launch imminent. Repeat, missile launch is imminent. 6 targets, hypersonic profile, launch facility coordinates follow. She began transmitting the precise geographic location of Installation 70 Vetter while simultaneously calculating intercept vectors. The physics were brutal. Her F-35 was still over 100 miles away from the Russian facility, and hypersonic missiles would be traveling at over 15 times the speed of sound once they reached full velocity. But Daniella had spent months studying these exact weapon systems. She understood their flight profiles, their guidance mechanisms, and, most importantly, their vulnerabilities. The Zircon-M missiles were incredibly fast and maneuverable, but they were also dependent on precise guidance updates during their boost phase. If she could disrupt those guidance signals at exactly the right moment, the missiles might miss their targets by hundreds of miles. "Launch sequence initiated," Volkov announced at the Russian installation. "Firing in 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7. Daniella pushed her F-35 to its absolute performance limits, the aircraft's frame groaning under stresses that exceeded normal operational parameters. Her fuel warning lights were flashing red, but she ignored them. Everything now depended on the next 60 seconds. 6, 5, 4, 3. She activated every electronic warfare system in the F-35's arsenal, preparing to blanket the Russian installation with jamming signals the moment the missiles launched. 2, 1, launch! 6 pillars of flame erupted from the Arctic ice as the Zircon-M missiles roared skyward, their hypersonic engines accelerating them toward the American capital at impossible speeds. But as they climbed through the atmosphere, their guidance systems encountered something unexpected, a wall of electronic interference from a lone F-35 Lightning II that shouldn't have been anywhere near their flight path. The race to save Washington, D.C. had entered its final phase, and Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic was about to discover whether her years of intelligence analysis and combat training had prepared her for the most important 12 minutes of her life. The 6 Russian hypersonic missiles carved through the stratosphere like arrows of destruction, their plasma trails visible to satellites across 3 continents. Each Zircon-M was following a carefully calculated trajectory designed to evade American missile defense systems through a combination of extreme speed, unpredictable maneuvering, and electronic countermeasures. Within 12 minutes, they would deliver a coordinated blow that would decapitate American leadership and plunge the nation into chaos. But Colonel Viktor Petrov had made one critical miscalculation. His intelligence reports had accounted for every known American defensive system, every early warning radar, every interceptor missile in the U.S. arsenal. What they hadn't anticipated was Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic, alone in a stolen F-35 Lightning II, armed with nothing but electronic warfare equipment and an intimate understanding of hypersonic missile vulnerabilities. 68,000 feet above the Canadian Arctic, Daniella felt the G-forces crushing her body as she pushed the Lightning II through maneuvers that violated every safety protocol ever written for the aircraft. Her heads-up display showed a constellation of incoming threats, 6 hypersonic missiles climbing toward their cruise altitude, each one tracked by her F-35's advanced sensors with mathematical precision. The physics of interception seemed impossible. The missiles were traveling at Mach 15 and accelerating, while her F-35 could barely sustain Mach 1.8 at this altitude. In a conventional engagement, she would need to be positioned directly in their flight path with perfect timing to have any chance of success. But Daniella wasn't planning a conventional interception. Her years of intelligence analysis had revealed a critical flaw in the Zircon's design. During the first 90 seconds of flight, while the missiles were still receiving guidance updates from their launch facility, their navigation systems were vulnerable to specific types of electronic interference. If she could generate the right frequency patterns at precisely the right moment, she could corrupt their targeting data and send them off course. "NORAD control, this is Lightning 5052, Daniella transmitted as she aligned her aircraft with the missile formation. "Beginning electronic attack sequence. I need complete radio silence on all military frequencies for the next 3 minutes. Admiral Torres, monitoring the situation from her command center deep within Cheyenne Mountain, felt her stomach clench as she watched the tactical display. 6 enemy missiles were screaming toward the American capital, while a single F-35 attempting an interception that every military doctrine said was impossible. "All stations, this is NORAD control," Torres broadcast on the emergency frequency. "Clear all military communications immediately. Lightning 505 is engaging the threat." Daniella activated her F-35's AN/ASQ 2039 electronic warfare system, the most advanced jamming equipment ever installed on a fighter aircraft. But instead of using it defensively, she began broadcasting a complex pattern of signals designed to mimic the guidance frequencies used by Russian missile control systems. Her plan was audacious to the point of insanity. She was going to try to convince the missiles that she was their launch facility. The first indication of success came from Missile 3, designated for the Pentagon strike. Its navigation computer, confused by Daniella's false signals, began making course corrections based on corrupted data. Instead of maintaining its precise trajectory toward the Pentagon's E-ring, the missile began a subtle turn northward, its targeting system convinced that it needed to adjust for atmospheric conditions that didn't actually exist. "One missile showing course deviation," reported Major Volkov from Installation Severny Vetter, her voice tight with concern. "Missile 3 has altered trajectory by approximately 2 degrees. Colonel Petrov studied the telemetry data with growing alarm. 2 degrees might seem insignificant, but at hypersonic speeds over intercontinental distances, it would cause the missile to miss its target by dozens of miles. Check the guidance systems. Something is interfering with our control signals." But Daniella was just getting started. Her electronic warfare suite was now broadcasting on multiple frequencies, each signal carefully calibrated to exploit different vulnerabilities in the Russian missile guidance systems. She had turned her F-35 into a flying electronic warfare platform, using every technique she had learned during her cross-domain warrior training.
Missile 5, targeted at the Capitol building, began exhibiting erratic behavior as its altitude control system received conflicting instructions. Instead of maintaining its optimal flight path, the weapon started a series of unnecessary maneuvers that bled off precious velocity and fuel. Each course correction took it further from its intended target. In Washington, D.C., the emergency evacuation was proceeding with controlled urgency. President Carter had been moved to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, a hardened bunker beneath the White House designed to survive direct nuclear attack. Congressional leadership was being evacuated from the Capitol building, though many representatives insisted on staying to ensure continuity of government. At the Pentagon, General Harrison found himself in an impossible situation. Every military doctrine he had ever studied said that hypersonic missiles were essentially unstoppable once launched. American interceptor systems weren't designed for targets moving at Mach 15, and the time between detection and impact was too short for conventional defensive measures. Yet his tactical displays were showing something unprecedented. Several of the incoming missiles were deviating from their predicted flight paths. The woman he had dismissed as mentally unstable appeared to be accomplishing something that the entire American military establishment had deemed impossible. "Sir," Colonel Barnes approached with a secure phone in his hand. "Admiral Torres is requesting permission to coordinate directly with Colonel Dragic. She believes the electronic warfare attack might actually be working." Harrison stared at the tactical display, watching as Missile 3 continued its northward drift. His career had been built on the assumption that military hierarchy existed for good reasons, that experienced leadership could make better decisions than subordinates acting on their own initiative. But the evidence before his eyes suggested that Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic had just accomplished something that his entire staff of experts had declared impossible. "Sir," Colonel Barnes approached with a secure phone in his hand. "Admiral Torres is requesting permission to coordinate directly with Colonel Dragic. She believes the electronic warfare attack might actually be working." Harrison stared at the tactical display, watching as Missile 3 continued its northward drift.
His career had been built on the assumption that military hierarchy existed for good reasons, that experienced leadership could make better decisions than subordinates acting on their own initiative. But the evidence before his eyes suggested that Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic had just accomplished something that his entire staff of experts had declared impossible. "Sir," Colonel Barnes approached with a secure phone in his hand. "Admiral Torres is requesting permission to coordinate directly with Colonel Dragic. She believes the electronic warfare attack might actually be working." Harrison stared at the tactical display, watching as Missile 3 continued its northward drift. His career had been built on the assumption that military hierarchy existed for good reasons, that experienced leadership could make better decisions than subordinates acting on their own initiative. But the evidence before his eyes suggested that Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic had just accomplished something that his entire staff of experts had declared impossible. 70,000 feet above Hudson Bay, Daniella was fighting the most complex electronic warfare battle of her career. Her F-35 systems were operating at their absolute limits, generating electromagnetic interference across dozens of frequencies while simultaneously tracking 6 hypersonic targets and maintaining her own aircraft's flight profile. The strain was enormous. Her fuel was nearly exhausted, her aircraft's electronic systems were overheating from the sustained jamming operation, and she was flying through airspace that was rapidly filling with debris from the missile's booster stages. But her tactics were working. Missile 1, targeted at the White House, had become completely confused by her false navigation signals. Its guidance computer was now convinced that it needed to perform a series of evasive maneuvers to avoid non-existent threats, causing it to waste fuel and drift off course. By Daniella's calculations, it would impact somewhere in the Potomac River, its warhead detonating harmlessly in the water. Missile 2 had developed an even more serious problem. Its altitude control system, overwhelmed by conflicting signals, had locked into a shallow dive that would cause it to impact the Atlantic Ocean hundreds of miles short of its target. The weapon that had been designed to crater the Pentagon would instead create a spectacular waterspout off the Virginia coast. But 3 missiles remained on target, their guidance systems either more sophisticated or simply less susceptible to her jamming attempts. Missiles 4, 5, and 6 were still screaming toward Washington, D.C., and Daniella was running out of time, fuel, and options. Her fuel warning system was now flashing critical alerts. She had perhaps 30 seconds of flight time remaining before her engines flamed out, and she would be forced to eject over the Canadian wilderness. The pursuing American fighters were closing in, their pilots still under orders to shoot her down, despite the evidence that she was single-handedly defending the nation's capital. "Lightning 5052, this is Admiral Torres," came a new voice on the emergency frequency. "Colonel Dragic, you have saved thousands of lives. 3 missiles are confirmed off target. Can you engage the remaining threats?" Daniella looked at her tactical display. The 3 remaining missiles were less than 6 minutes from impact, and her electronic warfare systems were beginning to fail from the sustained overload. Her jamming signals were weakening, and the missile's guidance systems were starting to compensate for her interference. In that moment, Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic made a decision that would either complete her mission or end her life. Instead of ejecting from her fuel-starved aircraft, she pointed the F-35's nose directly at the incoming missile formation and pushed the throttles to maximum power. If electronic warfare couldn't stop the remaining missiles, perhaps a more direct approach would succeed. She was about to attempt something that had never been tried in the history of aerial combat, a head-on ramming attack against hypersonic missiles traveling at 15 times the speed of sound. The final phase of the most desperate interception in military history was about to begin, and Daniella Dragic was gambling everything on a maneuver that would either save American democracy or vaporize her in a ball of superheated plasma. 47,000 feet above Baffin Island, Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic performed calculations that no pilot in history had ever attempted. Her F-35's heads-up display showed 3 hypersonic missiles approaching at a combined closing speed of over 11,000 miles per hour, a velocity so extreme that human reflexes were utterly inadequate for the task ahead. She would have to trust her aircraft's computers, her training, and a level of precision that existed at the very edge of physical possibility. Her fuel gauges showed fumes. Her electronic warfare systems were redlining from thermal overload. The pursuing American fighters were less than 2 minutes behind her position. And somewhere below, 3 Russian missiles carried enough explosive power to level city blocks, their targeting computers locked on to the heart of American democracy.
Computer, initiate collision course calculation, Daniella commanded, speaking to her F-35's artificial intelligence system. Target, incoming hypersonic missiles. Priority, maximum disruption of flight path. The Lightning II's quantum processors began analyzing thousands of variables simultaneously: wind speed, atmospheric density, missile velocity vectors, optimal impact angles. What it calculated would have been dismissed as impossible by every aviation expert in the world: a head-on ramming attack that would intercept 3 hypersonic weapons traveling at Mach 15. In the NORAD Command Center, Admiral Torres watched her tactical display with a mixture of awe and horror. The impossible was happening before her eyes. One woman in a stolen fighter jet was attempting to physically ram weapons that moved faster than anything ever built by human hands. "Ma'am," her communications officer reported, his voice tight with disbelief, "we're tracking Lightning 5052 on a direct intercept course with the remaining missiles. Her closure rate is beyond anything in our tactical databases." Torres activated her direct line to the Pentagon. "General Harrison, you need to see this. Your mentally unstable analyst is about to perform the most heroic act in military history." At the Pentagon, Harrison stared at his displays as the impossible unfolded. 3 years of dismissing Daniella's warnings, 3 years of questioning her judgment, 3 years of institutional arrogance suddenly collapsed into a single moment of crystalline clarity. The woman he had branded as paranoid was risking her life to save the very building where he sat in his comfortable office. "All stations," Harrison broadcast on the emergency frequency, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there hours earlier. "This is General Harrison. Colonel Dragic is authorized to use any means necessary to neutralize the threat. All pursuing aircraft are ordered to stand down immediately." Captain Sarah Williams, lead pilot of the F-16 formation that had been chasing Daniella across Canadian airspace, received the order with a mixture of relief and regret. For the past hour, she had been following orders to shoot down what she now understood was America's last hope for survival. "Lightning 5052, this is Viper Lead," Williams transmitted. "Good hunting, Colonel. Bring them home." But Daniella had no time for sentiment. Her missile warning system suddenly screamed as her radar detected the first hypersonic weapon, Missile 4, designated for the Capitol building. The weapon appeared on her display as a barely visible blip moving at a speed that challenged the F-35's tracking systems. In 8 seconds, their flight paths would intersect at a precise point in 3-dimensional space, creating a collision that would release energy equivalent to a small bomb. "Impact in 7 seconds, announced her aircraft's computer with artificial calm. "Recommend immediate course correction." "Negative," Daniella replied through gritted teeth. "Maintain intercept heading. 5 seconds. 4, 3. At the moment of contact, physics took over. The F-35 Lightning II, weighing 35,000 pounds and traveling at 1,200 miles per hour, met the Russian Zircon M missile, weighing 24,000 pounds and traveling at 11,500 miles per hour. The collision generated forces that instantly vaporized both aircraft, creating a fireball visible from the International Space Station. But the impact accomplished exactly what Daniella had calculated. The hypersonic missile's precision guidance system, designed to deliver its warhead within meters of its target, was catastrophically disrupted. Instead of maintaining its trajectory toward the Capitol building, Missile 4 tumbled out of control, its warhead detonating harmlessly over the uninhabited wilderness of northern Quebec. In Washington, D.C., seismometers detected the distant explosion as a minor earthquake. Congressional leaders, huddled in secure facilities beneath the Capitol, felt the building shudder slightly as shockwaves from the detonation traveled through the Earth's crust. They had no way of knowing that the tremor they felt was evidence that someone had just died to save their lives. But 2 missiles remained. Admiral Torres stared at her tactical display with growing desperation. Daniella's sacrifice had eliminated one threat, but missiles 5 and 6 were still screaming toward Washington at impossible speeds. American interceptor systems were finally coming online, but the weapons were too close, too fast, and too maneuverable for conventional defense. "Ma'am," her tracking officer reported, "remaining missiles will impact in 3 minutes 47 seconds. Target analysis confirms Capitol and Pentagon." Torres opened a secure channel to the Pentagon. "Madam President, we have confirmed impact in less than 4 minutes. Recommend immediate implementation of continuity protocols." President Elizabeth Carter, surrounded by her senior staff in the cramped confines of the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. In minutes, the carefully constructed system of American democracy might be reduced to rubble and ash. "Admiral," she replied with forced calm, "what are our remaining options?" "Ma'am, we have exhausted all conventional defensive measures. The remaining missiles are beyond our ability to intercept." But even as Torres spoke those words, something unprecedented was happening in the skies above the Canadian Arctic. The debris field from Daniella's collision was expanding at hypersonic speeds, creating a cloud of metallic fragments that stretched across several miles of airspace. The F-35's wreckage, combined with pieces of the destroyed Russian missile, had formed an unintentional obstacle that the remaining weapons would have to navigate. Missile 5, its guidance computer struggling to plot a clear path through the debris field, made a series of micro-corrections that bled off crucial velocity. Each maneuver cost the weapon precious fuel and altered its trajectory by fractions of degrees that would compound over the remaining distance to target. The weapon's sophisticated artificial intelligence, designed to evade conventional defenses, was confused by the unexpected obstacle. Its programming included thousands of scenarios for avoiding interceptor missiles, surface-to-air weapons, and electronic countermeasures. But it had no protocols for navigating through the debris field of a sacrificial collision. As Missile 5 attempted to thread its way through the expanding cloud of wreckage, its guidance system made a critical error. A piece of the F-35's titanium airframe, traveling at several thousand miles per hour, struck the missile's navigation antenna. The impact was microscopic by hypersonic standards, but it was enough to disrupt the weapon's ability to receive course corrections from its internal guidance system. The result was spectacular and terrible. Missile 5, blinded and confused, began a series of increasingly erratic maneuvers that sent it into an uncontrolled spin. Instead of impacting the Capitol building with surgical precision, the weapon plowed into the Potomac River at such speed that it created a waterspout visible from downtown Washington. The explosion sent a column of water and steam over 1,000 feet into the air. Windows shattered in buildings along the riverfront, and the shockwave triggered car alarms throughout the metropolitan area. But the Capitol building stood untouched, its dome gleaming in the afternoon sunlight as if nothing had happened. One missile remained. Missile 6, the final weapon in Russia's coordinated attack, had avoided the debris field entirely by following a slightly different trajectory. Its target was the Pentagon, the very building where General Harrison was coordinating the defense of the American Capitol. The weapon's guidance system showed green lights across all indicators: navigation nominal, target lock confirmed, impact in 97 seconds. In the Pentagon's command center, Harrison watched his own death approaching with a clarity that surprised him. After 30 years of military service, he had always assumed he would die in bed, surrounded by family and honors. He had never imagined that his final moments would be spent watching a tactical display show his own building's destruction. "Sir," Colonel Barnes approached with obvious reluctance. Barnes was a good officer who had followed orders and supported his superiors' decisions, even when those decisions were catastrophically wrong. Neither of them deserved to die for the institutional arrogance that had brought them to this moment. "Negative, Colonel. I will not abandon my post. If this building falls, I fall with it." But even as Harrison spoke those words, the final chapter of Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic's sacrifice was beginning to unfold. Her collision with Missile 4 had created more than just a debris field. It had generated electromagnetic pulses that were still propagating through the atmosphere at the speed of light. Missile 6's guidance system, designed to resist conventional electronic warfare, was suddenly bombarded by electromagnetic interference unlike anything its designers had anticipated. The pulse patterns were chaotic, unpredictable, and overwhelming, exactly the kind of interference that could only be created by the violent destruction of advanced electronic systems. The weapon's computer brain, struggling to process the electromagnetic chaos, began making microcorrections that gradually altered its flight path. Instead of striking the Pentagon's E-ring where Harrison waited, Missile 6 began a subtle drift that would carry it over the building and into the Virginia countryside beyond. At 3:47 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the final Russian hypersonic missile impacted an empty field 12 miles southwest of the Pentagon. The explosion created a crater visible from orbit and registered as a magnitude 4.2 earthquake on seismometers across the Mid-Atlantic region. But the American government survived. In the debris-strewn skies above the Canadian Arctic, scattered fragments of an F-35 Lightning II continued their tumbling journey toward Earth. Mixed among the wreckage were pieces of Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic's personal effects, her grandfather's watch, her security badge, and a small digital recorder containing her final intelligence analysis. The woman who had been dismissed as paranoid and unstable had saved American democracy through a combination of analytical brilliance, tactical innovation, and ultimate sacrifice. Her warnings had been ignored, her expertise dismissed, and her character questioned. But history would remember Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic as the intelligence officer who saw the truth when everyone else was blind and who paid the ultimate price to protect the nation that had failed to protect her. 72 hours after the failed Russian attack, the Pentagon's E-ring buzzed with an energy that General Robert Harrison had never experienced in his 30-year career. Congressional investigators, FBI counterintelligence specialists, and international media representatives filled corridors that normally housed only military personnel. The building that had nearly been reduced to rubble was now the epicenter of the most significant intelligence failure and heroic sacrifice in American military history. Harrison sat in his office, staring at a folder marked Eyes Only, Cross-Domain Warrior Program that had been delivered to his desk by a courier from the Defense Intelligence Agency's classified archives. Inside were personnel files, training records, and performance evaluations that painted a picture of Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic that was radically different from the mentally unstable analyst he had dismissed just days earlier. The woman he had recommended for reassignment to historical research was revealed to be one of only 3 officers to successfully complete the most classified pilot training program in American military history. Her intelligence analyses, which he had dismissed as paranoid speculation, were documented as having prevented at least 6 international incidents. Her psychological evaluations consistently rated her as exceptionally stable under pressure and capable of innovative thinking in crisis situations. Harrison closed the file and walked to his window. Overlooking the Potomac River, 12 miles away, a massive crater marked the impact site of the final Russian missile, a weapon that would have vaporized his office and everyone in it if not for Daniella's sacrifice. The irony was bitter enough to taste. The woman whose warnings he had ignored had died saving his life.
A knock on his door interrupted his brooding. Colonel Jeffrey Barnes entered, carrying a secure communication device and wearing an expression that Harrison had never seen before, a mixture of shame, regret, and barely contained anger. "Sir," Barnes began, his voice carefully controlled, "I have Admiral Torres on secure video. She's requesting an immediate conference regarding the classified investigation into the Russian attack." Harrison activated his secure monitor, and Admiral Rebecca Torres appeared on screen from her command center at NORAD. Behind her, Harrison could see analysts working frantically at computer terminals, processing intelligence data that would reshape American understanding of modern warfare. "General Harrison," Torres began without preamble, "I've spent the past 3 days reviewing every communication, every intelligence report, and every tactical decision related to the Russian attack. What I've discovered is going to end careers and change how the American military handles threat assessment forever." Torres turned to someone off camera, and a new figure appeared on Harrison's screen. Dr. Sarah Chen, the Pentagon's chief intelligence analyst and a woman whose reputation for thoroughness was legendary throughout the defense establishment. "General," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "Lieutenant Colonel Dragic's intelligence analysis was not only accurate, it was the most sophisticated threat assessment I've ever reviewed. She identified the Russian hypersonic weapons program 6 months before our most advanced intelligence agencies detected its existence. Her target predictions were accurate to within 50 meters. Her timeline estimates were precise to within 12 minutes. Harrison felt something cold settling in his stomach. "Dr. Chen, are you saying that—" "I'm saying that Colonel Dragic provided you with intelligence that could have prevented this entire crisis," Chen interrupted. "If her warnings had been taken seriously, we could have implemented defensive measures, coordinated with international allies, and possibly prevented the attack entirely. Instead, she was dismissed, humiliated, and forced to act independently to save American democracy." The secure line crackled as Admiral Torres leaned forward. "General, I've been authorized by the Joint Chiefs to inform you that a formal investigation is being launched into the intelligence failures that led to this crisis. The focus will be on why accurate threat assessments were ignored and how institutional biases prevented proper evaluation of critical intelligence." Harrison's career flashed before his eyes. 3 decades of distinguished service, countless commendations, the respect of his peers. All of it was about to be destroyed by his failure to recognize the truth when it was presented to him. But more than his career was at stake. The investigation would inevitably reveal the systematic dismissal of warnings that had nearly cost American democracy its very existence. "Admiral," Harrison said slowly, "what are the recommendations of the investigating committee?" "Complete restructuring of military intelligence evaluation protocols. New systems for ensuring that analyst warnings receive proper consideration regardless of the analyst's rank or background. And, General, there will be personal accountability for the decisions that led to this crisis." After the conference ended, Harrison sat alone in his office as the weight of his failure settled upon him. Through his window, he could see the Washington Monument standing intact against the afternoon sky, its presence a reminder of the democracy that Daniella Dragic had died to protect. His reflection was interrupted by commotion in the corridor outside. Harrison opened his door to find a crowd of reporters and military personnel gathered around a television monitor mounted on the wall. On screen, President Elizabeth Carter was addressing the nation from the Oval Office. "My fellow Americans," the president began, 3 days ago, our nation faced the most serious attack on our homeland since Pearl Harbor. 6 hypersonic missiles launched by hostile forces targeted the heart of our democracy, the Capitol building, the Pentagon, and the White House. The attack was prevented not by our sophisticated defense systems, not by our advanced early warning networks, but by the heroic sacrifice of a single intelligence officer who saw the truth when others chose blindness." The president paused, her voice carrying the weight of national grief and gratitude. Lieutenant Colonel Daniella Dragic, an analyst with the Defense Intelligence Agency, identified the threat months before anyone else. Her warnings were dismissed, her expertise was questioned, her character was attacked. Yet, when the moment of crisis arrived, she risked everything and ultimately gave everything to protect the nation that had failed to protect her. Harrison watched as the president continued her address, announcing the creation of the Daniella Dragic Institute for Strategic Intelligence Analysis, a new organization designed to ensure that critical threat assessments would never again be dismissed due to institutional bias or hierarchical prejudice. Colonel Dragic will be posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor our nation can bestow. But more importantly, her sacrifice will serve as a permanent reminder that truth and expertise exist at every level of our military and intelligence services, and that our survival as a democracy depends on our willingness to listen to those who see clearly, regardless of their rank or status. The crowd in the Pentagon corridor began to disperse, but Harrison remained transfixed by the television screen. Archive footage was now showing Daniella's F-35 Lightning II during one of her training flights, the aircraft graceful and deadly as it carved through desert skies. The woman piloting that aircraft had possessed skills and knowledge that surpassed most of the Pentagon's senior leadership. Yet, she had been treated as an inconvenience to be managed rather than an asset to be valued. Colonel Barnes approached, his expression grim. "Sir, I've just received notification from the Secretary of Defense's office. You've been requested to appear before the Senate Intelligence Committee next week to testify about the intelligence failures that preceded the attack."